Before we begin, I need to ask you a question. What if an entire family claimed to be attacked by invisible forces within their own home? What if doctors, social workers, and even police officers recorded behaviors they themselves couldn't explain? What would you believe? What would you do if you were there, witnessing everything with your own eyes? Today you will learn about one of the most disturbing and controversial cases in the United States in recent years. An episode involving possession, official investigations, hospital records, and an exorcism authorized by the church. This is the story of the Latoya Ammons case in Indianapolis. In 2011, Latoya Ammons moved with her mother and 3 children to a seemingly ordinary house in a neighborhood in Indianapolis, Indiana. The residence had nothing extraordinary about it at first glance. It was a simple, middle-class house on a quiet street. But, according to Latoya, shortly after moving in, strange events began to occur. At first, they were noises. Footsteps in the basement during the early morning hours. Doors creaking on their own. Whispers that seemed to echo through the hallways. The family tried to ignore it. Old houses make noises, they said. It could be the plumbing, the wind, the heating. But the sounds began to become more intense and frequent. According to the family's account, swarms of flies began to appear inside the house, even during the harsh Indiana winter, when freezing temperatures normally prevent this type of infestation. Latoya stated that the flies concentrated mainly on the enclosed porch of the residence. Her mother, Rosa Campbell, said she had witnessed the same things. As the weeks passed, the phenomena became more disturbing. Latoya stated that her children began to exhibit strange behaviors. The eldest son reportedly began to growl and show his teeth aggressively. The daughter claimed to see shadowy figures walking around the house. The youngest said he heard voices. What could initially be explained as childhood imagination began to take on more serious dimensions when, according to the family, the children started acting violently and unusually. The situation caught the attention of the school, which notified the authorities after worrying reports. Child protection services were activated. Social workers visited the house. Police officers also attended the scene on more than one occasion. And it is here that the case begins to take a turn that goes beyond the family account. According to documents released later, a police officer reportedly recorded that, during a visit to the residence, he heard a strange voice echoing in the basement. Another officer reported feeling an unusual presence. These records further fueled the narrative that something inexplicable might be happening. But, at the same time, mental health professionals began to consider other possibilities: stress, trauma, collective suggestion. The line between belief and reality began to become increasingly blurred. What began as nighttime noises was about to transform into one of the most debated cases in recent history involving alleged demonic possession in the United States. And what would happen next would lead this family into a hospital, into the center of an official investigation, and eventually, into a religious ritual that would make headlines across the country. As the reports intensified, the routine inside the Indianapolis home began to completely deteriorate. Latoya Ammons claimed that her children weren't just hearing voices or seeing shadows. According to her, the physical manifestations were becoming increasingly evident and frightening. At one point, Latoya reported that her 12-year-old daughter began to levitate above the bed during the night. She said the girl was lifted a few centimeters off the mattress while sleeping, and that upon waking, she remembered nothing. The children's grandmother, Rosa Campbell, confirmed witnessing the same episode. According to both of them, it didn't seem like a dream or imagination. It was something physical, visible. The reports also included the presence of wet footprints appearing on the living room floor, as if someone had walked through the place with soaked feet, even when no one was there. The marks, according to Latoya, appeared suddenly and disappeared shortly afterward. The children's behavior continued to draw attention. The eldest son, who was 7 years old at the time, reportedly began growling intensely, baring his teeth at adults. He also allegedly tried to attack family members for no apparent reason. The daughter said she felt something pulling her feet at night. The situation reached a critical point when the school notified the Department of Children's Services after observing drastic changes in the children's behavior. Authorities decided to investigate. Social workers went to the residence. During one of the visits, according to official reports released later, one of the children began speaking in a deeper voice, different from his usual voice. The social worker recorded that the child seemed to enter a trance. At another time, the same professional reported that the boy had walked backward, climbing a wall to the ceiling, supporting himself only with his hands and feet. This part of the report would become one of the most controversial points of the case. The description was signed by professionals who were present at the time. For many, it seemed impossible. For others, it could be the result of mass hysteria or an exaggerated interpretation. Following these events, the children were taken to the hospital for medical evaluation. There, psychologists and psychiatrists began to analyze the case from a clinical perspective. Some hypotheses raised included behavioral disorders, influence of the family environment, possible suggestion, or even malingering. But the tension increased. Latoya insisted that it wasn't psychological. She firmly believed that her family was being attacked by something evil. The house, according to her, was infested with demons. It was at this point that she sought religious help. A local priest was contacted to assess the situation. Initially, there was skepticism. The Catholic Church is known for being extremely selective before authorizing any exorcism ritual. It is not a decision taken lightly. The priest decided to visit the house. He listened to the accounts, spoke with the family, and prayed there. According to Latoya, during the prayers, objects moved and strange noises echoed again through the basement. Meanwhile, hospital records and reports from the Department of Children's Services began to pile up. The case was no longer just a domestic matter. There was official documentation describing behaviors considered inexplicable. The question that began to arise was inevitable. Was this family experiencing a genuine case of possession, or were they all caught in a spiral of fear, stress, and psychological suggestion? And what would happen in the hospital days later would make this story even harder to ignore. In the hospital, the environment was supposed to represent safety, rationality, and control. Doctors, nurses, and social workers were accustomed to dealing with emotional crises, outbursts, and extreme behaviors. But what was described in the following days would transform that case into something that surpassed the common limits of clinical explanation. During one of the evaluations, Latoya's son exhibited behavior that caught everyone's attention in the room. According to later records released by the press, the boy began to speak in a deep voice, different from his childish voice. He reportedly stared fixedly at the social worker and said that she would die, using a tone considered threatening and unusual for a child of that age. The professionals initially treated the episode as a possible dissociative episode. Children subjected to high levels of stress may exhibit temporary personality changes. The psychological hypothesis was still the strongest at that moment. But the most controversial episode occurred soon after. According to documentation from the Department of Children's Services, in the presence of hospital staff and a social worker, the boy allegedly walked backward toward the wall, supported himself with his hands and feet, and supposedly climbed onto the ceiling, moving horizontally before falling to the floor. This description was officially recorded. This was not just a family account, it was part of an institutional document. The social worker reportedly stated that she had never witnessed anything similar in her entire career. It is important to note that there is no video recording of this moment. There are no public images to corroborate what happened. What exists are written reports, signed by professionals. For some investigators, this is sufficient to consider the case intriguing. For others, without physical evidence, everything remains in the realm of human testimony, subject to error, interpretation, or even unintentional exaggeration. Following these events, the children were temporarily separated from their mother for investigation. The Department of Children's Services wanted to ensure there had been no abuse, neglect, or manipulation of behavior. The possibility of maternal influence was then considered. Latoya was devastated. She insisted she was trying to protect her children from something invisible and dangerous. In her view, removing the children would only worsen the spiritual situation. Meanwhile, psychologists conducted detailed assessments. Some reports indicated that the children might be reacting to the stressful home environment. Changes of residence, financial difficulties, and constant tension can trigger extreme behaviors. But there were details that continued to intrigue those involved. Professionals stated they felt a heavy atmosphere in the house during subsequent visits. Some reported feelings of unease and inexplicable discomfort. It was at this point that the case began to move beyond the local sphere. Information leaked to the press. The story of a possible demonic possession in Indianapolis began to gain public attention. And the more people heard the accounts, the more divided opinions became. Skeptics pointed to psychological and social explanations. Believers saw clear signs of supernatural activity. But what would truly change the course of this story was yet to come. With the growing media attention and officially documented hospital reports, the case ceased to be merely a family investigation and began to take on larger proportions within the city of Indianapolis itself. Latoya Ammons' name began circulating among social workers, police officers, and members of the local church. The situation was no longer seen merely as a possible domestic crisis, but as something that required a broader response. It was at this point that a local priest was called to visit the house. The clergyman listened attentively to Latoya's account and decided to perform a blessing on the property. During the visit, he reportedly stated that he felt a negative presence in the environment. According to later statements, the priest recommended that the family seek more intense spiritual help, as he believed that the issue could go beyond psychological matters. From then on, formal attempts to perform an exorcism began. The archdiocese responsible for the region carefully analyzed the case. The Catholic Church, historically, does not authorize exorcism rituals without a rigorous investigation. Before any approval, medical and psychological evaluations are required to rule out mental disorders or other clinical conditions. Meanwhile, the children remained under the care of the Department of Children's Services. Investigations sought to determine if there had been neglect, abuse, or manipulation. Some professionals suspected that the accounts might have been amplified by the mother's own fear and belief. But something unexpected happened. A police officer who had visited the residence to investigate the report stated that he felt something strange inside the house. He claimed that his camera recorded unusual images, including alleged stains that appeared without explanation. Later, the same officer reported having faced personal and health problems after contact with the case, something he associated with the experience in the house. These testimonies reinforced Latoya's belief that she wasn't imagining anything. For her, each new account confirmed that something evil was truly present. The priest then decided to hold a series of intense prayer sessions with the family. During these meetings, Latoya reportedly exhibited behaviors considered unusual, including tremors, voice changes, and episodes of aggression. The priest interpreted these signs as possible spiritual manifestations. Even so, the church remained cautious. The decision to authorize a formal exorcism required higher approval. And that process could take time. While civil authorities analyzed the case from a rational and scientific perspective, the religious dimension gained strength behind the scenes. The confrontation between faith and skepticism began to define the next steps in the story. And it would be precisely this tension between spiritual and psychological explanations that would transform the case of Latoya Ammons into one of the most debated episodes in recent history involving alleged possession in the United States. With the church finally granting authorization for a formal exorcism, the case entered a new phase. The priest in charge began conducting more intense and structured sessions, following the protocols established by the Catholic Church for this type of ritual. Before each meeting, specific prayers were recited and religious objects were placed in the house. The sessions took place in a tense atmosphere. Latoya reported feeling intense headaches, pressure in her chest, and a constant feeling of being watched. At times, according to the priest's testimony, her posture would suddenly change. Her voice would become deeper, and she would resist the prayers. Her children, who were already under the supervision of the authorities, had also exhibited strange behaviors in previous moments, but were now away from the residence. This caused the focus of the sessions to concentrate mainly on the mother. During one of the rituals, the priest stated that Latoya fell to the ground and began to writhe. He described the scene as a strong spiritual reaction. For him, this indicated that the process was reaching something deep. The priest recorded details of the sessions and would later describe the experience as one of the most intense he had ever witnessed. At the same time, mental health professionals continued to monitor the case. Some specialists suggested that Latoya might be facing a dissociative disorder or another psychological condition aggravated by extreme stress. Media pressure and temporary separation from her children could have intensified the symptoms. This divergence of interpretations only increased the mystery. For the church, the signs were consistent with spiritual oppression. For some civil authorities, it was a delicate case involving psychological and social factors. The exorcism sessions continued for weeks. Gradually, Latoya said she began to feel better. She said the atmosphere in the house seemed lighter and that the manifestations had diminished. The priest also stated that he believed the evil had been expelled. Even so, the residence already carried a reputation difficult to erase. The story had spread throughout the city and the local press. The case began to attract national attention, especially after the official involvement of authorities and hospital records. The question that remained was simple and unsettling: had it all been truly supernatural, or a combination of fear, belief, and extreme circumstances? While the exorcism sessions continued, the case began to take on proportions that went far beyond a simple house in the Indianapolis neighborhood. What was once a family drama confined to the neighborhood now involved official documents, hospital records, police reports, and notes from the church itself. Each new detail seemed to fuel the controversy even further. The hospital where one of the boys was treated officially recorded an episode that would become the most impactful point in the entire story. According to the reports in the medical record, during a psychological evaluation, the boy began to growl, show his teeth, and speak in an altered voice. Healthcare professionals who were in the room stated that, at one point, he walked backward along the wall to the ceiling, giving the impression of defying gravity before falling back to the floor. This account, documented by more than one witness, became the central element of the case. For those who believed in the presence of the supernatural, it was definitive proof that something inexplicable was happening. For skeptics, it was necessary to analyze with extreme care the emotional context, the environment, and the possibility of misinterpretation amidst a situation of extreme tension. The social worker responsible for monitoring the family also recorded in a report that she witnessed behaviors considered unusual. On one occasion, she described the boy beginning to speak aggressively and threaten family members. At another time, she stated that she felt a heavy atmosphere in the house, as if the environment were charged. These accounts, however, also underwent critical evaluation. Experts argued that children exposed to prolonged stress, family instability, and strong religious influence may reproduce learned behaviors or internalize expectations from the environment. When adults around them begin to interpret signs as demonic manifestations, this can directly influence how the child reacts. The house, in turn, became a symbol. Neighbor after neighbor began to comment on strange events. Some claimed to have seen shadows in the windows. Others said they heard screams coming from inside the residence, even when the family was not present. The collective imagination began to shape the narrative. Over time, the story reached the national press. Television programs began to mention the case as one of the most mysterious ever recorded in the United States. The mixture of official documents with supernatural accounts created a combination too powerful to ignore. But while the world debated whether it was a case of demonic possession or an episode of mass hysteria aggravated by psychological factors, a practical question remained: the family was dysfunctional. The children had been temporarily removed from their homes. Latoya faced intense emotional pressure. The public exposure only increased the burden on everyone. During the final rituals conducted by the priest, specific prayers considered more severe were performed. He later stated that he felt a strong spiritual resistance, but that, in the end, he perceived a clear change in Latoya's posture. According to him, her gaze became more serene and the tension decreased. Shortly afterward, the family left the house. The residence was eventually vacated. For many, that would be the end of the manifestation. For others, it was simply the closing of a chapter in something that could never be fully explained. And then comes the part that divides opinions to this day: what happened after everyone left? When the hospital records came to light, the case ceased to be merely a family account and officially entered the institutional realm. The episode involving Latoya's son, who allegedly walked along the wall in front of medical witnesses, was described in the reports as abnormal and alarming behavior. Although healthcare professionals avoided any supernatural conclusions, the impact of the scene was enough for the Indianapolis Department of Children's Services to open a formal investigation into the children's safety. It was at this moment that the drama took on a new dimension. Until then, Latoya had faced suspicious glances, skeptical comments, and the emotional exhaustion caused by months of inexplicable events. Now, in addition to that, she needed to prove that she was a mother capable of protecting her own children. The suspicion raised by the authorities was not possession, but possible negligence or psychological influence of the mother over the children. Social workers visited the house. They photographed the rooms. They examined walls, floors, doors. They spoke separately with each child. The environment described in the reports was simple, organized, and without clear signs of physical abuse. However, the weight of the allegations was too great to ignore. Tensions increased when the children were temporarily removed from the residence for evaluation. For Latoya, this was devastating. She believed her children were being attacked by something invisible, something that couldn't be explained by doctors or psychologists. And now, in her view, they were being taken away from the very mother who was trying to protect them. Meanwhile, the press began to sniff out the story. Local journalists sought confirmation of details. The word exorcism began to circulate behind the scenes. The name of a priest who had allegedly visited the house began to be discreetly mentioned. The combination of medical reports, state intervention, and religious mentions created an explosive scenario. Latoya sought help from the church. According to later reports, a priest from the region had visited the residence to perform prayers and purification rituals. The family itself stated that the phenomena intensified when external attention increased, as if something reacted to the exposure. The department responsible for child protection, however, maintained a technical stance. Psychologists analyzed the possibility of dissociative disorders, mass hysteria, or suggestive influence. The phenomenon known as psychological contagion was considered a plausible hypothesis. When a family member strongly believes in a certain event, the others may unconsciously reproduce similar behaviors. But there was a problem. Not all episodes easily fit this theory. Some employees reported feeling discomfort in the residence. Others mentioned strange impressions during visits, even without officially registering any paranormal occurrence. The emotional climate of the case made it difficult to separate fact, perception, and interpretation. The conflict between faith and science was fully established. On one side, a desperate mother, convinced that her children were being attacked by evil forces. On the other, the state, trying to act rationally in the face of reports bordering on the impossible. In the middle, 3 children under intense psychological and social scrutiny. The story was no longer just a domestic case. It was beginning to transform into something bigger. An episode that would divide opinions, fuel debates, and eventually gain national attention. With the children temporarily removed from the home and under constant evaluation, the case entered an even more delicate phase. The Department of Children's Services needed to determine if there was a real risk to the children or if it was all a consequence of an environment of fear and reinforced belief within the home. Psychologists began interviewing the children individually, looking for inconsistencies in their accounts. What stood out was that, even separated, some of the children continued to describe similar experiences. They spoke of shadows, voices, and the feeling of being watched. For the professionals, this could indicate two distinct possibilities: either they were reproducing a narrative internalized over time, or they truly believed deeply in what they said they had experienced. Meanwhile, Latoya faced the weight of public suspicion. Part of the community began to question her mental health. Comments emerged insinuating that she might be encouraging her children's behavior. The possibility of a psychological disorder in the mother began to be discussed more intensely behind the scenes of the investigation. But there were also the accounts of professionals who had witnessed episodes considered out of the ordinary. The social worker who documented the wall incident maintained her version of events. She stated that she had no explanation for what she saw. The firmness of her account further fueled the controversy. Meanwhile, the priest overseeing the case decided to intensify his prayers. He believed the root of the problem lay within the house itself. According to later statements, he felt an oppressive presence in the basement of the residence. He performed blessing rituals, sprinkled holy water throughout the rooms, and instructed Latoya to pray daily. During this period, Latoya stated that she continued to experience intense physical sensations, sudden pains, pressure in her head, and recurring nightmares. On some occasions, she said she would wake up with scratches on her body. These details reinforced her conviction that she was dealing with something spiritual. The situation took on a new dimension when the case was reported by a major local newspaper. The article presented official documents, excerpts from reports, and testimonies from those involved. The story quickly spread across the internet. Radio programs began to discuss the matter. The Indianapolis case was no longer confined to the city. Experts invited to comment were divided in their opinions. Some stated that such cases usually involve psychological factors combined with strong religious belief. Others highlighted that the human mind is capable of producing impressive physical manifestations under extreme stress. But the narrative of demonic possession gained traction among the public. The mixture of official document with supernatural description created a story difficult to ignore. With increasing public pressure, the church decided to evaluate the possibility of a formal exorcism specifically targeting Latoya. The process required higher authorization and careful analysis. It was not something simple or automatic. And it would be precisely this decision that would mark the most decisive point in the entire story. The decision to officially assess the possibility of a formal exorcism marked the most critical moment in the entire story. The Catholic Church does not take this type of measure lightly. Before any authorization, it is necessary to rigorously rule out medical and psychological causes. The priest responsible for monitoring Latoya gathered notes, reports, and observations made over the previous weeks. He believed the signs were consistent with spiritual oppression. Meanwhile, on the civil side, psychologists continued to analyze Latoya's behavior. Some professionals hypothesized dissociative disorder, a condition in which a person may exhibit changes in behavior and identity under strong emotional stress. Others considered the possibility that the environment of intense belief was reinforcing each reaction, creating a difficult cycle to break. But there was a factor that complicated any simple conclusion: the documented accounts of independent witnesses. It wasn't just family members describing phenomena. There were social workers, healthcare professionals, and even police officers who recorded unusual experiences. Although none of them officially claimed to have witnessed anything supernatural, some admitted to having no clear explanation for certain events. The priest then received authorization to perform a minor exorcism ritual, a procedure involving specific prayers and formal invocations. The sessions took place in a controlled environment, without an audience, with only the priest and Latoya present. According to later accounts from the priest, during one of the sessions, Latoya exhibited a sudden change in posture. Her eyes fixed on a distant point, her breathing became heavy, and her voice took on a deeper tone. The priest stated that she reacted with intense resistance to the prayers, demonstrating unexpected physical strength. For him, this represented a direct spiritual confrontation. The sessions continued for several days. In each meeting, the priest reported feeling a kind of invisible resistance, followed by moments of apparent liberation. Latoya said she felt a weight being gradually lifted. The pain lessened. The nightmares began to cease. In parallel, the children underwent additional evaluations. Psychologists noted that, away from the home environment, the extreme behaviors decreased significantly. This detail was used by skeptics as an argument that the physical and emotional context of the residents played a central role in the events. But for Latoya, the improvement only occurred after the religious sessions. The confrontation between spiritual and psychological explanations became increasingly complex. Each side found evidence to support its own interpretation. When the priest declared that he believed the evil influence had been expelled, it seemed that the most intense chapter was closed. However, the true impact of the case was only beginning. Because what would come next would involve not only faith or science, but also money, media, and commercial interests. After the priest declared that the spiritual process had been completed, the atmosphere around the family began to change. Latoya stated that the house seemed different. According to her, the silence that had previously been disturbing was now just ordinary silence. The flies no longer appeared. The noises ceased. The constant feeling of oppression had disappeared. But while the family tried to rebuild their lives, the case had already gone beyond the limits of the neighborhood and the city. The national press began searching for official documents. Reports from the Department of Children's Services came to light. Excerpts from hospital records were released. The description of the wall incident spread rapidly. The story came to be called by some media outlets the case of the 200 demons of Indiana, a reference to the allegations that multiple entities were involved. The narrative took on even more dramatic contours on the internet, where expanded versions began to circulate. It was at this moment that a new element emerged in the story. A television producer learned of the case and expressed interest in acquiring the rights for adaptation. Hollywood's involvement brought another layer of complexity. For critics, this raised doubts about possible exaggerations. For defenders of the family, it was merely a natural consequence of the media attention. The house itself also became a focus of curiosity. The property was put up for sale. Some people claimed to have visited the place out of investigative interest. Others claimed to feel discomfort upon entering. Over time, the residence was eventually demolished, which for some symbolized the physical closure of the story. Meanwhile, experts continued to debate the case in programs and articles. Psychologists pointed out that situations of intense stress, combined with strong religious belief, can generate complex behavioral manifestations. The phenomenon known as collective suggestion was frequently cited. When an entire environment begins to interpret events through the lens of the supernatural, every noise can gain amplified meaning. On the other hand, defenders of the spiritual dimension insisted that the official records were too unusual to be dismissed. The presence of documentation signed by independent professionals fueled the idea that something extraordinary had truly occurred. Latoya, for her part, maintained her version of events. In later interviews, she stated that she lived through a period of real terror and that her faith was fundamental in overcoming what she faced. She maintained that she was not seeking fame, but protection for her children. The case had already become a modern symbol of the confrontation between faith and science. Unlike older stories, this one occurred in the 21st century, with digital records, official documents, and media coverage. But the central question remained without a definitive answer. What really happened in that house in Indianapolis? With the house demolished and the family trying to rebuild their lives far from their former residence, the case entered a phase of retrospective analysis. Now, far removed from the emotional heat of the events, experts began to revisit each detail with a more detached and technical eye. Documents were re-evaluated, interviews were reinterpreted, and theories began to be organized in a more structured way. One of the most debated points was the reliability of the official reports. The episode described in the hospital, involving the boy who allegedly walked on the wall, became the center of the controversy. For many investigators, the fact that the account was included in institutional documentation conferred significant weight. However, others argued that even trained professionals can interpret events under intense stress in a distorted way. Human memory is not perfect. In emotionally charged situations, perceptions can be influenced by expectation, fear, and context. This argument became widely used by psychologists who analyzed the case years later. Another aspect revisited was the family dynamics. Some experts suggested that the environment of constant tension could have created a cycle of behavioral reinforcement. If a child expresses fear and the adult immediately validates it as something supernatural, this can amplify the emotional response. The human brain is highly sensitive to social cues. But there was also the spiritual analysis. Religious figures who studied the case stated that certain described patterns were consistent with historical accounts of spiritual oppression. They emphasized that the church does not authorize formal rituals without careful investigation. The fact that an exorcism was conducted would indicate that there were elements considered serious enough to justify such a decision. The media coverage continued to fuel new layers of the narrative. Documentaries began to explore the case from different angles. Some emphasized the terror and the inexplicable. Others focused on psychology and social influence. The story also began to be used as an example in academic debates about modern mass hysteria. Professors discussed how, even in a technological age, deep-seated beliefs continue to powerfully shape human experiences. Meanwhile, Latoya herself maintained a firm stance. She declared that what she experienced was real and that faith was the only possible way to save her family. Her children, now older, kept a low profile. The case left a permanent mark. It became an obligatory reference whenever contemporary possession in the United States is discussed. But an important question remained to be explored: what was the definitive cultural impact of this story and how does it continue to influence public perception of the supernatural? Over the years, the Latoya Ammons case ceased to be just an isolated episode in Indianapolis and came to occupy a permanent space in the popular imagination. Unlike older accounts of possession that survived only through oral tradition or religious records, this case occurred in the digital age, with official documentation, journalistic coverage, and intense public discussion. The cultural impact began to solidify when major media outlets began to treat the episode as one of the best documented supernatural cases in recent United States history. The combination of hospital report, state investigation, and religious ritual created a narrative too powerful to disappear quickly. The internet played a fundamental role in amplifying the case. Forums, blogs, and specialized channels began to debate every detail. Excerpts from the documents were shared and analyzed line by line. Some users argued that it was modern evidence of demonic possession. Others dismantled the accounts from a psychological and scientific perspective. This phenomenon revealed something important about contemporary society. Even in a highly technological world, the fascination with the inexplicable remains alive. Cases like that of Latoya Ammons awaken something profound in the human mind. They touch on ancient fears, on the idea that invisible forces can act beyond our control. Experts in social behavior have highlighted that stories like this function as cultural mirrors. They reveal tensions between faith and science, religious tradition and modern rationality. When an event combines official documentation and supernatural elements, conflicting interpretations become inevitable. The case also reignited debates within the church itself about the need for extreme caution. Although the exorcism was authorized, the institution publicly reiterated that rituals of this type are rare and require careful investigation. The church sought to balance the confirmation of spiritual assistance with the responsibility not to encourage collective panic. On the other hand, mental health professionals used the case as an example of how intense stress can trigger complex behaviors. The combination of financial difficulties, family pressure, media exposure, and strong religious belief can generate manifestations that are difficult to interpret. The demolition of the house added a strong symbolic meaning to the narrative. For some, it was an attempt to physically close the chapter. For others, it further reinforced the mystery. The absence of the original setting left only accounts, documents, and memories. Over time, the story began to be adapted into audiovisual productions. Films and series inspired by the case emerged, reinforcing dramatic elements. The line between documented fact and artistic dramatization became blurred for the general public. And so, the Latoya Ammons case transformed into something greater than the initial events. It became a modern symbol of the eternal question that has accompanied humanity for centuries: are there forces beyond human comprehension, or can everything be explained by the mind and context? But there is still a final layer that needs to be explored before we conclude this story. To fully understand the Latoya Ammons case, it's necessary to look beyond isolated events and analyze the social and psychological context surrounding the entire situation. No event occurs in a vacuum. Each episode is shaped by environment, beliefs, past experiences, and external pressures. In 2011, when the family moved into the house in Indianapolis, they were already facing financial and emotional challenges. Moving house often generates significant stress, especially when children are involved. Adapting to a new neighborhood, new routines, and new schools can trigger insecurity. For experts, this type of transition can act as a trigger for atypical behaviors. At the same time, the strong religious influence in the family's life played a central role in the interpretation of events. When noises arose, they weren't seen merely as structural problems in the house. When the children reported seeing shadows, they weren't interpreted simply as imagination. The spiritual lens was always present. This doesn't invalidate the family's experience. On the contrary, for those who experience something intense, the perception is absolutely real. The fear felt is genuine. The anguish is concrete. The question lies in the origin of what is felt. Psychologists who studied the case highlighted the possibility of a phenomenon known as interpretive reinforcement. When an event is interpreted as supernatural, each subsequent occurrence is filtered under the same logic. A snap becomes a sign. A dream becomes a spiritual attack. Childish behavior becomes a demonic manifestation. On the other hand, theologians who analyzed the accounts pointed out that not all cases can be dismissed with simple psychological explanations. They argue that the church itself maintains rigorous criteria before validating any suspicion of possession. The fact that an experienced priest considered the case serious reinforces, for some, the spiritual hypothesis. The hospital episode remains the most sensitive point. If the account is exactly as described, it defies common explanations. If there is an error in perception or narrative amplification, it fits within the human limitations of memory and interpretation. The case also highlights the power of collective narrative. When the media entered the scene, the story took on a new form. Dramatic headlines amplified details. Expressions like 200 demons transformed a complex account into a sensationalist symbol. Media simplification often eliminates important nuances. Today, more than a decade later, the case continues to be debated in academic and religious forums. Not because there is conclusive evidence on either side, but precisely because it remains in a gray area. And stories that inhabit this area tend to survive for a long time. But we still need to address the personal outcome for the family and what really changed after the rituals ended. After the religious sessions ended and the family permanently moved to another residence, life slowly began to settle into a new rhythm. Away from the old house, without the constant pressure of noise, reports, and official visits, the environment became more stable. According to later statements, the phenomena that had been described simply ceased. The children, now out of the focus of the investigation, began to exhibit behavior considered normal for their age. Psychologists who followed the case observed that, away from the original setting, the extreme manifestation significantly decreased. This detail was used by critics as a central argument that the home environment and emotional context had played a determining role. But for Latoya, the explanation was different. She believed that the spiritual intervention was what brought peace to the family. In interviews given years later, she stated that she no longer felt the presence she had described as oppressive. For her, the process was real, painful, and necessary. Rebuilding their lives was not simple. The public exposure left its mark. The family faced judgment, comments, and speculation. In cases like this, even as time passes, the narrative remains associated with the names of the people involved. The story becomes part of their public identity. Meanwhile, the debate continued behind the scenes. Social psychology experts analyzed the case as a modern example of how belief, stress, and context can interact powerfully. Theologians cited the episode as one of the few contemporary cases with extensive documentation involving possible possession. The demolition of the house brought a symbolic sense of closure. The physical space where everything supposedly occurred ceased to exist. Only accounts, documents, and memories remained. This, in a way, contributed to the case definitively migrating from the realm of events to the realm of narratives. Stories like this survive because they offer something few others can: legitimate doubt. There are no conclusive recordings. There is no definitive scientific proof. Nor is there a confession of fraud. What exists is a collection of testimonies, documents, and interpretations. And perhaps it is precisely this absence of a final answer that keeps the case alive in public discussion. But before we can completely conclude this story, we still need to reflect on what it reveals about us as a society. After the religious sessions ended and the family permanently moved to another residence, life slowly began to settle into a new rhythm. Away from the old house, without the constant pressure of noise, reports, and official visits, the environment became more stable. According to later statements, the phenomena that had been described simply ceased. The children, now out of the focus of the investigation, began to exhibit behavior considered normal for their age. Psychologists who followed the case observed that, away from the original setting, the extreme manifestation significantly decreased. This detail was used by critics as a central argument that the home environment and emotional context had played a determining role. But for Latoya, the explanation was different. She believed that the spiritual intervention was what brought peace to the family. In interviews given years later, she stated that she no longer felt the presence she had described as oppressive. For her, the process was real, painful, and necessary. Rebuilding their lives was not simple. The public exposure left its mark. The family faced judgment, comments, and speculation. In cases like this, even as time passes, the narrative remains associated with the names of the people involved. The story becomes part of their public identity. Meanwhile, the debate continued behind the scenes. Social psychology experts analyzed the case as a modern example of how belief, stress, and context can interact powerfully. Theologians cited the episode as one of the few contemporary cases with extensive documentation involving possible possession. The demolition of the house brought a symbolic sense of closure. The physical space where everything supposedly occurred ceased to exist. Only accounts, documents, and memories remained. This, in a way, contributed to the case definitively migrating from the realm of events to the realm of narratives. Stories like this survive because they offer something few others can: legitimate doubt. There are no conclusive recordings. There is no definitive scientific proof. Nor is there a confession of fraud. What exists is a collection of testimonies, documents, and interpretations. And perhaps it is precisely this absence of a final answer that keeps the case alive in public discussion. But before we can completely conclude this story, we still need to reflect on what it reveals about us as a society.